Hello, I am Luba Vangelova. I am the founder of The Hub, which can be found at thehub.community if you want to learn more about that. And I am here again with Stephanie Sewell. If you could once again just briefly introduce yourself for those of you who didn't catch the previous interview with you.
Of course, yes, happy to. So I'm Stephanie Sewell. I live in Chelsea, Quebec in Canada. And as a former teacher, I wound up homeschooling my kids for varying lengths depending on the child. And I now work as an alternative education consultant and mentor. So that means that I help families find and navigate an education path that really works for that child. And as a mentor, I help young people kind of figure out what it is they need right now and be that person for them to discuss and explore.
All right. So, in this segment, we're going to talk about something that you've mentioned you advise parents on, uh, specifically situations where parents want to do more interest-led learning, but they live in states, countries, regions, whatever it is, that have certain specific official requirements that are on the more stringent side. So, how can someone follow a more interest-led learning pathway in that kind of situation? What advice do you um, generally give?
Well, where I invite them to start is in the moment. So I talk to them about the idea of capture the moment, which means what's going on for your child, your family right now. So think about a tree. Think about the roots as being the things that keep everybody happy, healthy, grounded, what's working. Think about the branches as being the outer, what shows of that. If they're on a soccer team and they just love it, and that's one of the highlights of their week, that's a branch. Like, what are the ways that your child is really shining? What are the times that they shine? And that's where you want to start from when you're figuring out what it's going to look like to homeschool, as opposed to understanding what your state or provincial requirements are and starting from there.
Hmm.
So one is, this is our decision. This is what's going to work for us. This is what we need. This is what we think life without school can be for us and for our child. And how are we going to move ahead with that? Oh yeah, we have to fill out some forms as well. Versus, oh, I have to figure out exactly what the government thinks I need to do and figure out how to do it. And it's a very kind of anxiety provoking, fear-based way of living. One of the analogies I like for that is thinking about your finances and tax returns. So you have to fill out tax returns, you have to report once a year, but you don't make all your financial decisions according to what a government department is telling you to do. I mean, obviously that's the analogy isn't 100%, but it's that notion of no matter what requirements you may or may not have from your governing body, it still makes sense to get very clear on what you want first. Then you start to make the links to what the requirements are.
Hmm.
So I'm sure we'll delve into that a little bit more, but one example is, say your child really loves to garden and they just like growing things, and you grow a lot of what you eat, and they have a beautiful flower bed, and that's just something that they've always done. They've always liked it. So you can look at what your child is doing and think, how can I represent that according to the categories that I'm required to report on? So if you're required to report on science, then it's fairly obvious to think about how to make those connections. If you're required to report on English, and in that comes communications, well, the way that you communicate with your child around planning the garden is an example you can give for that. So starting with what makes you thrive as a family and figuring out how that in itself can meet requirements. And then you may have some gaps. In Quebec, there's something called a situational problem in math, which many families find that's just not something that we can pull out of our regular life. And so we sit down and actually do situation problems once a month or whatever it is that each family decides to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's where you start with is the important piece.
All right. And so do you find that parents struggle a little bit to map what their child is interested in with what, their state requires? Do you find that can be challenging?
Well, I'm going to give you two answers. One is the answer I would have given a year ago, and one is the answer I can give now. So the year ago answer is it's a bit like exercising a muscle. So it takes a little while to kind of look at your kid, quote unquote, playing, quote unquote, doing nothing, and to see, okay, what's going on. So the way to approach it is as an exercise, really. It's like a curiosity. If I print out, the curriculum for this grade level that my child would be in if they were in school, what can I possibly extract from what they're doing right now? If they're playing with Lego, is it the fine motor? Oh, we can talk about that. Like, just it's a muscle, and you can invite other people to help you figure it out. So there's that, and that's still a wonderful way to do it. And now that we have Chat GPT, it's a whole different thing. You literally can put into Chat GPT, how does my child playing with Lego connect to, the grade 3 math curriculum? And you will get some ideas. Of course, you're not getting your answers, and that would be a really interesting interview topic, actually, because it's, we have this sense around, kids in school and university are not allowed to use ChatGPT to generate answers. So where there's a bit of a sense I'm finding with parents of thinking, well, like, is it okay to do that? But it's as if you think of it as that, a substitute person that you're talking to who can just help you start thinking in that way of how do I represent that as that? It's a really, really helpful tool that we have available to us right now.
Interesting. Yeah, and there's also another website whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, where you type in activities and
Yeah,
it
I
spits
might be able
out.
to find it, and we can include it in the
Yeah,
link. Something subject, like it has the word subject in it.
yeah, something like that. All right, and then so for the gaps, like, do you? I guess, does there tend to be less resistance on the part of the children to cover those things that are identified as gaps because of their realization that it's just part of the hoops they have to jump through, however one chooses to see it, either as hoops or as bona fide, um, useful things for their life, whatever. I mean, um, uh, does there tend to be less resistance on the part of the children then to do those things because it's not coming directly from their parents, but from an outside source?
I think it depends on the child. And in contrast to how I just kind of explained it, I think it can also be a reassurance to the child that those outside sources, outside requirements are there. If a child is feeling any sense of anxiety or concern around whether their educational path is as legit as that of their peers in school, then having these requirements, making sure that all the boxes are checked, can actually be extremely reassuring to them and allow them to really capitalize on all the rest of the time and opportunities that they have because they aren't in school. So it's not necessarily, the concept of it is actually not necessarily negative for some children. For children who are just so, they're so ready to be themselves and lead themselves, those requirements can be a real thorn in their side, and it can definitely be easier to feel that they and their parent are on the same team with an outside, evil source of requirements. And I see it being handled differently by different families. For some families, they will really try to, as much as possible, not even have their kids be aware that there's an external reporting requirement, because they feel that that's anxiety provoking in the child. Because it's an odd kind of dynamic, right? Like for the child, the parent is, you want to be able to trust your parent and feel safe with your parent, and your parent is the one who makes good decisions and all of that. So if you're aware that your parent is in some way being assessed by some external source for how well they're homeschooling you, like that's a very what's the word I want? Like it makes you, it really can get to the heart of your ability as a child to trust your parent. Like it can be a very, very negative dynamic that is being set up there. So if some parents, and it varies so much from state to state, province to province, what that relationship with the governing body looks like. But as a result of that danger, some parents will really choose to try to protect their children completely from the knowledge that it even exists, or protect them as much as they can. And one of the things I generally will recommend to parents is try to set up a dynamic of we're all in this together. Like I parent and you resource person or homeschool liaison or whatever you're called, we are working together to help this child have the most wonderful educational experience as possible. Kind of going into it with that feeling as a parent versus, an almost inevitable feeling of like, oh, I hope it goes okay. I hope they think it's okay. And it's hard not to feel that, because ultimately that person often does have the power to force you to send your child to school. It's usually not a simple process for that to happen, but it is often the potential end result. But remembering that, you are that child's parent and you are an expert in that child, and trying to set up a dynamic where you're inviting that government representative into this relationship of educational wonderfulness can really help shift things.
Interesting. Do you find that's kind of a difficult mentality to adopt? I mean, if a parent, I guess, feels like they're being questioned and judged, to then look at that through the lens of this person is trying to help me rather than to hinder me. I mean, do you find that's a bit of a difficult
So
thing?
just to clarify, what I was suggesting was that the parent invite the resource person or representative to help.
Okay, got it.
So not that, I mean, depending on the context, some of the resource people are there to help in theory, as well as to judge, which gets a bit complicated, but it's how are you going to engage in your relationship with that government person? Can you engage in it as I'm inviting you into this thing that I'm doing, homeschooling my child, versus going in scared from the outset? It's sort of it can be a difficult thing to do, but it can be enough to how you present yourself, how you present your what you're expecting the conversation to be can, from my experience, make a big difference. And I also have clients who've had very negative experiences with these meetings or relationships in the past. And for them, the main thing is I just want to know exactly what all the requirements are. I want to meet all the requirements as simply and as concisely as possible, and not allow any space for any kind of engagement beyond what is absolutely strictly necessary.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose it comes down to what we talked about in the other segment about consent. And if the parent isn't feeling like this is something they've consented to, I imagine that colors their perception of how they view it. But so so yeah, I mean, I do think there is probably I mean, do you think in a sense, it kind of brings up to parents, it's like they themselves are back in school and being graded by a teacher. I mean, it kind of feels like that sort of dynamic. Sometimes when I see in discussion groups, people worrying about basically what grade they're going to get. um, and so in some way, it's a little bit of kind of a flashback, which probably lends it some more emotional weight depending on how the parent themselves did in school and how they felt about their school experience. Would you say, that affects how they feel about that?
100%.
Okay.
And I mean, this is going kind of into a deeper level, but it's very helpful to think about what you were like as a student
Mm.
before you engage with the government representative. And for so many of us, we were the child who wanted to please. And our main goal was to please by getting good marks, by getting, verbal or physical pats on the back that we were doing well. So when we step into this relationship with the government person, which absolutely makes us feel like student and teacher again, we can often find ourselves falling into wanting to be praised.
Mhm.
And that's great if the government person understands the many ways that homeschooling can look and is on board and is collaborative and like fantastic, have a good relationship. But the danger of that is that if we're still coming from a place of wanting to please, then we can get more and more separated from what's the actual well-being need of our family, of our child, and fall more and more into what do we need to do to please the government.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so it's being very intentional about that relationship. So some of the things that I've recommended and that I've seen work is be aware of when you have to, like, obviously you're aware of when you have to connect with them and what you have to show them. But then decide how you're going to interact with that. So, if you have to make a report at the end of the year, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be thinking about that report every time you and your child sit down to do something that feels like an educational activity. It might mean that you just do your thing and completely forget that there's going to be a requirement until January. And then you look back, well, what have we done? What did we do over the fall? How did it feel? Oh, I'm realizing we've done a bunch of things that I'm going to be able to put in the report. Amazing. Just kind of worked out that way. But there's definitely some gaps. So maybe we'll take these winter months when we're indoors a bit more, and maybe we'll take those months and just, grind through some math that we're going to put in that report or whatever it is. So you can make the choice about how it shows up in your life.
Mm.
So one of a slide that I often show in presentations is how we can feel like our family is the sun and we're having this beautiful experience, and then there's this like thundercloud of the government requirements. We can feel it like that. So what can we do to transform that so that we're still the sun, and one of the rays is the government? So those government requirements, it's still there, but the big thing is our family thriving. And that reporting requirement isn't a part of us thriving because it's there, we can't deny it, but it doesn't have to be the thundercloud that hangs over us. Or if you really can't get away from it being a thundercloud because your family is, what happens here sometimes is if somebody if the representative isn't happy with the way things are going, then you get kind of flagged, and you do have to follow closer and closer and closer to the requirements. So it does feel like a thundercloud. So what are the ways that you can put an umbrella up? I guess umbrellas aren't very safe with thunderstorms, but you know what I mean? How can you provide yourself shelter from that? How can you create moments where you're just ignoring it because in that moment in time, you don't have to think about it. That's really important to create that balance so that as much as possible, you are consenting, not to the fact of them being involved, but to how you choose to work your life around their involvement. You are consenting to something.
Mm-hmm. And so sometimes when people are worrying about some possible negative outcome, it can be recommended for them to think about what's the worst thing that could happen and kind of work through in their head the worst thing happening and so on, and realizing that even if the worst thing happens, they can survive. They can, it's not the end of the world. It's not the end of their world. So do you find that can be helpful at all? And I mean, you mentioned that often, I mean, I don't know if since, there's so many different places in the world, I don't know if this applies universally, but I guess at least in many cases, a flag or a warning would come before kind of a final decision that you no longer have the privilege. We are withdrawing the privilege we have given you to homeschool and are now going to require you to send your child to school. Do you find that kind of envisioning the worst case and kind of mentally preparing for that is helpful?
It might depend. Well, there's two things. It might depend on what the worst case scenario is. There are contexts where the worst case scenario can be removing the child from the home.
Oh, okay.
And that's not a situation that anybody wants to be imagining. But what I would say, in the absence of that kind of threat, which fortunately is extremely rare, when we don't want our kids to be in school, it's usually because they've either already been very hurt by school or because our ideology is for them to live a life that doesn't include school. So them being forced to go to school can feel like the worst thing. But time and time again, I've heard of situations like you see families where the child might decide to go to school even though the parent thinks it's a bad idea, but that kid gets to school and suddenly like they meet this child who becomes a wonderful friend, and that child also had some maybe homeschooling background, or and the two of them become fast friends and they navigate the school experience in a way that is really positive. Or your child might arrive at school and there's some teacher that is there that just makes all the difference. There's at my local high school here, there's a person who's in a guidance role. And I know of 4 kids personally from whom she has been a lifeline. Like her being there and them knowing that they can go and talk to her has made school doable. Without her, it would have been a truly awful experience. So if that worst case scenario happens, imagine it with a positive slant. You might not be able to imagine what that positive slant is going to be, but allow space for there to be something positive in it.
To kind of knowing that there would be ways to mitigate, whatever the downside is. And, that might help take some of the pressure off. Yeah. So
I'll just add into that, if you don't mind. One of the things that I've had some interesting conversations with teens who've left school about this. School, the context is usually you have to do your best, always do your best. But life isn't like that. As adults, we choose where we put our best
Yeah.
effort and where we just kind of get it done. So if we can invite school kids to start thinking like that as well, then that's incredibly empowering in a system that can be overwhelming. So, you have to take away the desire to always have high marks every single year. And maybe you need to say, well, high marks actually only matter when you're getting close to applying to university. Other than that, it doesn't matter what your marks are. So what if you decide where your priority is? If you really love science, then like go for it. If you really hate English, then just write an essay that's good enough that it's going to be accepted as a pass, and just forget it. So we can empower our kids to not be as harmed by a situation that might otherwise have been very harmful, and even to find good in that situation by helping them learn how to manage it. And that's looking through that different lens.
Mhm. All right. And do you recommend any sort of like uh, tips on how to deal with the state requirements? I mean, do you um, like recommend that parents look at the language that is used in what the evaluators, what they themselves are looking to check off of, on their sheets, like in some way finding what they need to, which boxes they need to check, and like seeing the language that's used there and kind of using similar language so that it's easy, like making it as easy as possible for them to map what you've been doing to the boxes that they need to check.
I think that's a great strategy. I mean, it definitely makes it easier for them.
Mhm,
And as long as it's not making it too difficult for you,
mhm,
it's going to make the whole process easier.
mhm.
Sure.
Okay. And basically going into it as, I understand you're doing your job, and I, understand what you need to do. So, here is.
Yeah, I think with that you have to be careful. Um, Depending on the person, depending on the government body they're working for, what they see their role as being can be very delicate. So if they see that their role is, to make sure that this child is getting an education, and like they're coming from a place of being really concerned that this kid isn't in school, and then if your child is nervous about talking to them and doesn't really present very well if they have to present, or your child is late writing and like they think that the writing, like, so if that examiner or person starts to have some concerns, they may, like, from the depths of their heart, really be feeling that this kid is in danger in some way, and that if you're not getting it, then it's up to them to really help make sure this child gets a proper education. So if we're starting to think about how to make their job easily done so that we can continue on doing what we want to do, then I think it's also important to recognize that scenario where they may truly be concerned, or they may also be really interested. Like I have one friend who was in a really difficult situation with, it had gotten to Children's Aid Society, and she had been reported. It was a very complicated situation, but she decided that she was just going to kind of take the lead in the conversation. And she spent like half an hour telling this person about homeschooling and in all its different flavors, and her kids were unschoolers, and it ended up with the person thanking her for educating him, because he hadn't had that, he didn't know what to look for.
Mm,
So the situation in Quebec has shifted away from that process now, but that kind of thing can be true, is that the person that you're having to report to might actually not know how to understand what your reality is. So part of what you need to do is simply translate, and they might be very happy to understand how you do things. There's so many different things that could be true in those relationships. One thing that's, I think, can be very helpful is to find out if you're allowed to have somebody else with you.
mm,
And that might be the person who knows the law really well and ensures that things are not being asked that aren't allowed to be asked. It might be the person that can, help you, like nudge you to say things that you're not thinking to say, or like whatever it is, just knowing that it's not just you and them, that kind of potentially adversarial thing. That can be really, really, really helpful.
Okay. All right. And also, I imagine talking to, like if this is new to you, talking to other parents who have been through the process and can demystify it and
Yeah.
kind of just give you the lay of the land.
I think that's important.
Probably.
And likewise, asking for any requirements in writing so that you are really clear on what is the nature of this meeting or documentation? Like, can you put it for me in writing so I absolutely understand what it is and have that there? Like I was talking to one parent recently who has her midterm meeting coming up, and we were talking about putting post-it notes all on her screen, things of just like reminders to herself to help her feel grounded, and things that she wanted to make sure she said, so that you can kind of prompt yourself in advance for things can be very helpful as well.
Okay. And all right. So I think we've covered everything unless you have anything else to add.
I'll add just one thing quickly that's sort of related and sort of not. One of the things that I have often help people with is a transcript for self-directed learning.
Mhm.
And this can be used in contexts where you're having to report when your child is still of school age. So what it is it's something that kind of details what it is that your child is doing. It might be in academic terms and non-academic terms. And it's a way of just kind of showing what's the totality of your child's education. You can use it to explain the bigger picture to somebody you have to report to, if you feel that that's going to be helpful. It may be not helpful, but it's an option if you feel it's helpful. And then it's the kind of thing that can be used as part of a university application process. So that notion of creating your own documentation that serves your purposes, that accurately describes what your child's experience has been, can be very helpful as well.
All right. Well, thank you. And so you talk to parents not just within Canada.
Yeah, so I consult with clients all over the world. Of course, when we have a situation when there's specific reporting requirements, I will often refer them to the appropriate local expert on that. But yeah, because so much of what I believe to be important and what I can share that helps is about the how of thinking about education and thinking about childhood and life, which is of course universal. And I do also, as I mentioned at the beginning, mentor teens, whether it's online or in person, and that can be a very helpful piece to all of that as well.
Right. And if you could just once again mention how, if anyone wants to follow up with you directly, how they might be able to contact you.
Of course, yeah, you can contact me through my website, which is stephaniesewell.ca, or on Facebook or LinkedIn at Stephanie Sewell Education.
All right. All right. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's been a lovely conversation.
Yeah, same here.